All right, today let's talk about some essential chemistry for biology. The really basic stuff you need to understand. And starting with the most basic, everything is made up of matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. Mass is just a measure of how much matter a thing is. We normally, in our day-to-day life, talk about weight, which is the mass pulled on by gravity. And as long as we're talking about things on Earth, mass and weight are the same thing because everything's being pulled on by the gravity of the Earth and therefore the same mass and weight. But if you were to go to the moon suddenly, you would have the same mass, but your weight would change because the moon has less gravity. So you would actually lose weight. Cool weight loss trick, right? Kidding. You can't just zip to the moon because then when you come back, you're going to have the same weight again when you started. So what you really want to do is not lose weight. You actually want to lose mass or gain mass if you're trying to build up muscle. Matter, this mass stuff, is composed of elements. Elements are the substances that can't be broken down into other substances without losing their characteristics. And the smallest unit of each element is an atom. So let's look at what this is. An atom is a tiny little thing that is a nucleus with electrons zipping around it. The nucleus is made up of neutrons that have no charge and protons that have a positive charge, hence the pro. The electrons zip around the nucleus in a little cloud, and they carry a negative charge. They're very, very small little particles. It's really important that the electrons are constantly moving around the nucleus because that actually gives all atoms movement. And a lot of the physical properties that we're going to talk about that are important in biology and anatomy come from this constant movement of the electrons, which moves the atoms. So hang on to that. We're going to come back to that later. And Science Cat wants you to remember this, so remember that. That'll be $5 for the electrons. The neutrons are free of charge. Get it? Because the neutrons don't have any charge. So protons positive, electrons negative, neutrons neutral. All right, so you've seen the periodic table of the elements before. It looks like this. Very intimidating. Fortunately for biology, we don't need most of it. We really only need the first couple of lines. And so let's look at what this is telling us. The top number is the atomic number, the number of protons in the molecule, which is going to be the same number as the number of neutrons. The symbol is the abbreviation of the name, and every single element has a different symbol. So even things that, maybe another thing that starts with H, such as helium, it's going to have a different symbol. Notice that some have a capital letter and a lowercase letter. Some are just a capital letter. It is vitally important that you write those correctly, because if you were to say write A and capital L instead of a little l, you wouldn't be talking about aluminum anymore. Then we have the full name and then the atomic mass, which is the mass of the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons, which is usually double the number of protons, but not always. Too complex for us. Take physics if you want to understand that. All right, the most important elements for biology are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Just those four, those are the big ones that you need to know. Notice that they're all really simple elements with very few protons. That's going to be kind of helpful. All right, now whenever we put two or more atoms together, we make a molecule. Molecules are made when atoms either share electrons, when their electrons are attracted to each other, or when one atom gives electrons to another one. We write the name of the molecule as a chemical symbol, and that chemical symbol tells us how many of each atom is in the molecule. So H2O, that's our good friend water. 2 hydrogen atoms, that's the H, the lowercase, the subscript 2 means 2 hydrogens, and then 1 oxygen. We don't write a 1, we just put an O. So H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom. Molecules are formed by creating these chemical bonds between atoms, and we can distinguish these bonds by whether the electrons are given, shared, or there's just an attraction between the electrons. Atoms are stable when their outer shell of electrons is either completely full or empty. What does that mean? For the smallest atoms, helium and hydrogen, they have one outer shell that can hold 2 electrons. So hydrogen has 1 electron, and it either wants to share another electron so that it has 2, or give up this electron so it has none. Either way, much more stable than having this one unpaired electron hanging out by itself. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. So it's stable when it takes or shares 4 electrons. It almost always shares. It's very, very rare for carbon to just take. These are called, when atoms share electrons, we call it a covalent bond. So the 2 atoms are sharing the electrons. They both get to count the electrons as their own, and then they each have completed their own outer shell. So this is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogens. Each hydrogen now has 2 electrons, so it's happy. The carbon now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Everybody's happy. Now, in another form, some atoms, if you've got, say, 1 electron in the outer shell, or you're just missing one, it's actually easier to just give up the electron to another atom. So this is sodium, which has 1 outer shell electron, and this is chlorine that has 7 and is missing 1. So wouldn't it be easy if sodium gave its electron to chlorine? And that's how they bind together. This is called an ionic bond because after sodium has given up its electron, chlorine has taken the electron, they both have a different charge and a different electrical charge than they started with. Remember that the electrons carry a negative charge. So an ionic bond, remember, one atom gives an electron, another atom takes it. You can remember this because the name is bond, ionic bond, taken, not shared. So when sodium chloride makes a molecule, sodium gives up an electron, chlorine takes the electron. They create, without the presence of water, a solid crystal called sodium chloride or table salt. Sodium has lost a negative electron, so it becomes a positively charged particle that we call an ion or a cation. Cation means it's positively charged. Chlorine becomes a chloride ion. It's negatively charged because it took that extra negative, and that's called an anion. So any positively charged ion is a cation, and a negatively charged ion is an anion. Easy to remember, anion, an is not, so anion is negative, and cation is positively charged. Got it? All right, now, the third type of bond that we need to know about is actually really, really important and very, very weak. It's called a hydrogen bond. These are very weak attractions between the hydrogen atoms in one, usually water molecule, and negative particles in another water molecule. The one we care about for our purposes for general biology and for anatomy is the attraction between water molecules. So notice that in a water molecule, here's our H2 and our O. The O is much bigger than the H's. The H's are really tiny. Because the O is bigger, it actually is able to pull the electrons closer to itself. The hydrogens, therefore, are slightly positively charged because even though they're sharing that electron, oxygen is sharing it more, right? Oxygen is taking more of it. So there's more negative charge toward the oxygen, more positive charge toward the hydrogen. So we have a negative pole and a positive pole to the molecule. So we call it a, wait for it, polar molecule. Water is polar. Because water is polar, other polar molecules will dissolve in water. One of those is sodium chloride because it's made of ions. They stay ions even when they dissociate or dissolve in water. Oil, on the other hand, is nonpolar. So oil and water don't dissolve together because one is polar, one is non-polar. To help you remember that, here's a polar bear drowning. He says, help, help, I'm dissolving. And the brown bear says, but bears are insoluble. And the polar bear says, that's easy for you to say, you're not polar. Polar bear. Okay. All right, so hydrogen bonds individually are very, very weak. But in water, because there are so many water molecules, the sum total of the hydrogen bonds ends up being a very strong attractive force. So because the oxygen molecule is negative and the hydrogens are positive, we get these attractions between one end of one water molecule and the other end of another water molecule. This creates cohesion. Cohesion is the tendency of water molecules to stick together. And we can have cohesion in other kinds of molecules as well, but again, for this class, our most important thing is water. Cohesion is really important because it creates surface tension. Surface tension is the measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break the surface of a liquid. So you may have seen like a leaf floating on water, and if you poke at the leaf, it'll sink, but the leaf was stretching the bonds between the water molecules, but not enough to break them, and so it ended up floating. And that's actually how boats float as well. It's kind of cool because some animals are lightweight enough and spread out their mass enough to not break the surface tension in water, that cohesive force between water molecules. So here we have a water bug sitting on the surface of the water. This is a reflection of the bug. And this is a lizard walking on the surface of the water, or running. And for those of you who think that's not, the ground is right under there, he's not really walking on water, guess what? Yes, it is. Look at how big the feet are in this lizard, and that because of that, it's able to spread out its mass and enough so that it can shift its weight before the foot breaks all the way through the surface, and it can run on water. And yes, because it walks on water, it's called the Jesus lizard. Most elegant creature on earth. Water is super important because all life depends on water. All life evolved in the primordial soup that covered the earth before life evolved. And so water is the basis of all life on earth. Now, water is the solvent, meaning the thing in which things are dissolved. So a solution is any liquid with something dissolved in it. The dissolving agent, the liquid, is called the solvent, and the thing dissolved in it is called the solute. If water is the solvent, we call it an aqueous solution. Aqueous comes from the root aqua, for water. So an aqueous solution is a water-based solution. And all the important fluids in the body are aqueous solutions. Blood, all the extracellular fluid around cells, all the fluid inside cells. Urine, sweat, these are all aqueous solutions. Also, all of our favorite liquids are aqueous solution. Cola, beer, fizzy water, Red Bull, anything you want, coffee, tea, those are all aqueous solutions. In an aqueous solution, ionic molecules actually dissociate. And this is what happens when they dissolve. The two atoms actually separate from each other, but they keep the electrons that they took, or they don't take back the electron that they gave away. So when sodium chloride, that is table salt, dissolves in water, the positive sides of the water molecules are attracted to the negative chloride ion, and likewise the negative sides of the water molecules are attracted to the positive sodium ion. Remember, chloride is an anion, sodium, cation. And so because there's so many water molecules and they have this polar force, they're able to separate the ions, and that's what happens when something dissolves in a fluid such as water. Now, one thing that happens in aqueous solutions is that some of the water molecules actually break apart into a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion, or an OH. So they actually separate. And if we get even numbers of hydrogen and hydroxide ions, then we say that solution is neither an acid nor a base, it's neutral. Anything that releases extra hydrogen ions is an acid. So you've heard of hydrochloric acid. This is actually the acid that's present in your stomach. It dissolves into a hydrogen ion and a chloride ion. Because it produces extra hydrogen ions, it's an acid. Bases release hydroxide into the solution and absorb the hydrogen ions. So something like sodium hydroxide is a very powerful base. When it is added to water, it dissociates into sodium and a hydroxide ion. A lot of these hydroxide ions bind with the hydrogen ions, and some of them even cause water molecules to separate so that they can have a hydroxide to bind with. So then it removes the hydroxides from the solution, removes the hydrogen ions from the solution, leaving hydroxides, and we call that a base. We measure the strength of an acid or a base on the pH scale. The pH scale is annoyingly calculated as a negative algorithm of the number of hydrogen ions. We're not going to worry about how we calculate that. The only thing you need to know is because it's a negative logarithm, the lower the number, the more hydrogen ions. Okay, so powerful acids have a low pH. So pH of 0 is the most acidic, pH of 14 is the most basic or alkaline, and pH of 7 is neutral. Pure water, it has a pH of 7. Pure water is very hard to come by because as soon as you put water in a container, it starts to react with whatever that container is, and then it's not pure water anymore. But when we have pure water, it's absolutely neutral. Now, human blood, slightly basic, okay? And it's really important that human blood stays in this really narrow range of pH. If you get even a little bit too basic or too acidic, you can actually die. Seawater, the ocean is a little basic, which is why it's bad that we are adding carbon dioxide to the ocean, because that makes the seawater more acidic. We'll come back to that later. Just if you want to go look that up, go look up carbonic acid. But CO2 dissociates and creates an acid. Some of our favorite things to drink, like black coffee is acidic, soft drinks are acidic, lemon juice is really acidic. Some people now drink alkaline water. That just means that it's basic, okay? Just remember that when you add an acid to a base, they neutralize each other. So if you drink alkaline water, it hits your stomach where there's stomach acid and neutralizes. Yeah, it's not really an effective thing to do. It will have no effect on your health. Both strong bases and strong acids are dangerous to living tissue. Okay, so that's really important to know. All right, so here's a meme. Dihydrogen monoxide is an acid with a pH level of 7. That's a higher pH level than any other acid. Okay, this is funny because dihydrogen monoxide, dihydrogen, 2 hydrogens, monoxide, 1 oxygen, is H2O. It's water. It's actually not an acid. It's neutral. It does have a pH of 7, which is neutral. That's a higher pH than any other acid. Yeah. Lower pH is stronger. Isn't that funny? It sounds really alarmist and scary, but it's fun. All right. Now, what happens when we take molecules and we put them together? In either creating or breaking up molecules, we are doing a chemical reaction. A chemical reaction is just rearranging the molecules by breaking bonds and or forming new chemical bonds. Anytime we create chemical bonds, that is going to absorb energy, and very importantly for biology, we're going to store energy in those chemical bonds within the molecule. In order to release that stored energy, we can break those chemical bonds. That's going to release energy. Okay? That's one of the ways that we get energy from food, especially glucose. Your cells use the chemical bonds inside a glucose molecule, release that energy, and then store it in another molecule called ATP that we're going to come back to in a little bit. And then they can use that stored energy in ATP to make other things happen in the cell. That's going to be incredibly important. That's the most common way that things move around and chemical reactions happen in a cell. All right, so ATP. Its name comes from, the whole name is adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so A for adenosine, T for tri, and P for phosphate, adenosine triphosphate. So it's an adenosine molecule bound to 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. A phosphate group is a phosphorus with 4 oxygens. So we've got one there, one there, one there. Yes, they're sharing the oxygens because that's how phosphate groups bind together. The cool thing about ATP is that when we break this bond right here between the second and third phosphate, we release energy. In order to store energy for use again, we can just remake this chemical bond. And that is what your mitochondria do. When we break that bond, we end up with what we call adenosine diphosphate. We still have the adenosine, and now we have 2 phosphates, okay? The other phosphate has broken off, and it's going to need to be reattached so that we can use the ATP again. And that's what your cells do. They're just constantly using ATP over and over and over and over again, creating ADP and free phosphates. Think of it like charging a battery. When you've got the ADP with 2 phosphates and an extra phosphate, you've got a battery that's not charged. The mitochondria then put the phosphate back onto the ADP, creating an ATP, storing a little bit of energy in this bond. Now our battery's charged. This little battery of ATP can then go out into the cell, to get broken again, to use the energy stored in this bond. So because the mitochondria make this molecule that the rest of the cell uses for energy, that's why we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell. So you may never again, if asked, what's a mitochondria? You can't just say it's the powerhouse of the cell. You got to say they make ATP, which the cell uses for energy. Cool, right? All right, let's talk about some other important biomolecules that you're going to need to be familiar with. Lipids are fats. Everything categorized as a lipid. Lipid is just another word for fat. A fat is one or more chains of carbon and hydrogen, like here or here. This one has 2 chains, and this one has 3. And those chains are bound to some other molecule. In this case, it's a phosphate. In this case, it's a glycerol. This one is called a phospholipid. It's a phosphate and a lipid. Okay? This is going to be incredibly important in cells. And this one is called a triglyceride. And this is the most common way that fats are stored in your body. So here we have a glycerol molecule with much longer chains of carbon and hydrogen. And these are called fatty acid chains. Okay, so those are lipids. There are some other lipids that are hormones like steroids, which are also lipids but not chains. Okay, they're kind of a different class. Carbohydrates are sugars. All carbohydrates are sugars. All sugars are carbohydrates. It's a synonym. Okay. The basic unit of sugar is a monosaccharide. That means a simple sugar, just one single molecule of sugar, mostly carbon with hydrogen and oxygen. And most sugars that are biologically important have either 5 or 6 carbons. However many carbons they have the same number of oxygens and twice that number of hydrogens. Okay? So they all have the same basic pattern. This is glucose, which is the most important monosaccharide, because remember, this is the one that its energy is going to be used to make ATP. Here it is in a line. Most often in an aqueous solution, it actually curves in on itself and makes a ring. Okay? Now, a polysaccharide is a long chain of monosaccharides, and the most biologically important polysaccharides are polymers of glucose molecules. So this is a starch molecule, and you can see it's just a bunch of glucose molecules chained together. This is really important biologically because our bodies are able to break these bonds between these glucose molecules, very quickly free up this glucose to go to our cells and make ATP so that our cells can do the things they need to do. So this is a really quick and fast form of energy, which is why we like glucose, which is why we like starch so much, because it's really good energy. When there's excess glucose, your cells, special cells in your body, in the liver and your skeletal muscles, are going to store glucose as glycogen, which is another polymer of glucose very similar to starch. So those are the carbohydrates. All the carbohydrates are sugars. Okay, now the other group of important biomolecules that is a polymer are proteins. Proteins do so much in the body. Every single protein is a polymer of amino acids. There are 20 amino acids in nature. Your body can make most of those if you give it other amino acids. There are 7 that your body can't make, so we call those the essential amino acids. You have to get those from your food. Proteins start out with, this is the structure of an amino acid, and the primary structure of a protein is that it makes a polymer, a chain of amino acids. Then that chain folds, either folds like this or curlicues, helices like this, and then those fold again to create a more complex three-dimensional structure. And then sometimes multiple proteins like this band together into a single ginormous molecule. The molecule that connects a phosphate to an ADP to make ATP contains, I think, 120 protein sections in one molecule, all bound together into one gigantic molecule. Okay? Proteins are really, really important. They give structure. So our hair and nails are actually made out of the same protein called keratin. Our connective tissues are made up largely of collagen and elastin, which are both proteins. The structure of cells themselves are going to be maintained by a cytoskeleton that's made up of protein strands. Moving things in and out of cells is going to happen with proteins shaped like channels or pumps that actually transport things across the membrane. Also, moving things within the cells is going to require changing the shape of protein molecules. Hormones, lots of hormones are proteins. They're going to be really important for signaling from one cell to another cell a long distance away. And then enzymes that make and break chemical bonds in other molecules. All enzymes are proteins. So proteins are an incredibly diverse and important group of molecules. They all come down to being a strand of amino acids, being a polymer of amino acids. And then our final group of biomolecules are the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA, ribonucleic acid. Both of these are polymers of nucleotides, which is this molecule right here. This is a 5-carbon sugar with a phosphate on one side and a nitrogenous base on the other side. DNA and RNA each have 4 different bases, although they use 3 of the same bases, and then they each have a different 4th base. And those bases can bind together in a predictable way, and the sugar and phosphate bind together to create a long strand with these sort of ladder rungs across it that make up the DNA double helix. In DNA and RNA, which is usually single-stranded, The cell can store and transmit information. And so all of the information about how to make you is stored in DNA inside the nucleus of your cells. All the instructions for how to make everything in every cell on Earth is stored in DNA. Those are biomolecules and the basis of biological chemistry that you need to know. If you get confused about some stuff, come back to this lecture, watch it again, and if you have any questions, give me a holler.